second half of the lesson looks at the major issues in society and the major trends in society in the 1920s. We'll start with framing it in context. F. Scott Fitzgerald, one of the great American writers of the 20th century, probably in many people's estimation, the greatest writer America produces in the 20th century, will actually become one of the lost generation, will run off to Paris to sort of get away from the high-flying materialism of the 1920s. And effectively, him and other novelists will portray a sense of futility in their work. They'll basically say that it was an age of borrowed time anyway, the whole upper tenth of the nation living with the insouciance of grand dukes and the casualness of chorus girls. In other words, people were living beyond their means, and they were living, let's just say, a materialistic and shallow life. Now, the major problems that stem out of the 1920s, the big ones anyway, societally, can usually be traced to prohibition. Of course, the 18th Amendment, we know lots about that, okay? It reduces the quantity of booze sold in the 1920s, and even after it's repealed, the consumption rate remains quite slow to rise. But it was massively, massively unpopular. It was generally ignored. Bootlegging becomes, as we've learned, a multi-billion-dollar industry, which leads to crime in a big way. Of course, at the age of 26, the biggest gangster in the world is Al Capone out of Chicago. He leads the Big One crime syndicate. He uses violence to enforce his control of alcohol. You've already learned about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and if you put it in perspective, he made $60 million a year on selling illegal alcohol in the 1920s. Capone himself lives this insane life of crime, flaunting it in the face of law enforcement, the Treasury Department, who were too weak and too underfunded to really enforce the Volstead Act. And in the end, Capone does go to jail, but he goes to jail for tax evasion. He doesn't go to jail for the bootlegging operation, which is the primacy of his business. The other aspect that we talked about has to do with corruption. The 1920s are known for many things: economic boom, but also horrendous corruption at the government level. The Teapot Dome scandal, which doesn't bring down the Harding government, mostly because Harding dies before it can really stain him, but leads to the fall of Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior. He takes a $300,000 in loans and bribes to allow oil speculation on treasured conservation land in an area known as Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and also in California. The investigation into Albert Fall lasts 6 years, and he's jailed and fined $100,000. Teapot Dome really becomes a symbol of corruption in the government in the 1920s. The Attorney General at the time, the person in charge of bringing cases forward, is also investigated for corruption. So the people who are actually policing the government are actually corrupt themselves. Okay? Effectively, what we see throughout the 1920s is a pattern emerging. The government supports the wealthy through tariffs, through reduced taxes on corporations, through defunding or limiting the ability of organizations like regulatory agencies like the FTC and the Federal Trade Commission in doing their job. Okay, and what eventually happens is not only do they limit them in terms of funding, they pack these commissions with people who are pro-business. And these pro-business people let laissez-faire go out of control. The Supreme Court at this time is led by William Howard Taft, the former president, the person who is challenged so thoroughly by Roosevelt in the 1912 election because he backed down on his progressive ideals. And Taft himself, in a job he much preferred to his own admission, protects business from antitrust legislation. So corruption is endemic this entire time. The second major issue in society is immigration. And immigration becomes a massive issue in 1920s, leading to, in fact, a massive curb in immigration in 1924. Before 1920, 25 million foreigners had arrived on American shores. This sort of surge in immigration was unique in world history. Never before had more people moved further and more in greater numbers than they had to America before the 1920s. Not going to go into large detail about this. You can read about it, but you know the content. You got Italians, Poles, Jews, Slavs, okay? What we should also remember is that not only do they come, okay, to chase their American dream. Many, many, many of them actually leave once they find the American dream effectively unattainable. Okay, the new immigrants who start to come by the 1920s are also distinct in the fact that most don't even want to stay. What do we get in the 1920s with the birth of a little bit more quicker and efficient transportation systems, and certainly cheaper ones, are immigrants coming over to work and then return home. These are called itinerant workers, mostly male, mostly young. They basically go to America in hopes to earn enough more money in their temporary stay in America to be able to go back to the homeland and afford an increased lifestyle. By 1920, something like 50 to 80% of this new immigration are believed to eventually return to their country of origin. The one exception, of course, really being the Jews, who had to leave their country of origin to flee pogroms and oppression and things like that, and therefore returning isn't necessarily a real big option. The other one, of course, is the Irish, who are fleeing horrible economic conditions in Ireland and also religious persecution at the hands of the Protestant minority, and the English, the British, who control Ireland at that time. What we also have is the development in the 1920s of the urban enclave or the ghetto. Okay, despite these high rates of returning to their own country, known as repatriation, the new immigrants as a whole, there are enough of them coming that put down roots in America to boost the foreign population of the country to record levels. Okay, um, in the 1920 census and the 1930, about 15% of the American population is foreign born. That's quite a lot. Um, by 1920, in some major cities, in fact, like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, over 40% of the individuals residing in that city were not born in the United States of America. And what happens as a consequence of this with these large immigrant groups is that you get the birth of large, bustling, very enclosed ethnic enclaves known as ghettos. Okay, people speak little or no English. They settle together for religious community reasons. They create their own ethnic shops, their ethnic markets, their ethnic banks, clubs, and on and on and on. Though invaluable to the American economy, to the diversity of America as a whole, they are insular. And as a result, people start to rally against them. In time, though, these communities will their insularity will be overcome by the predominance of American culture, particularly movie culture. Because when these people want to take part in the America and they want to share in American culture, it starts to break down the barriers. TV, though that comes much later on, but more particularly in the 1920s, film and radio begin to break down these sort of ethnic enclaves. Additionally, the small family run shop is attacked in the 1920s in the Great Way by the birth of the big department store or the chain store. The 1920s sees the birth of large department chains like J.C. Penney and Macy's in America. And as a consequence of this, they start to take away the market share from the small businesses who go out of business. And in that sense, you start to lose a little bit of that ghettoing. What you actually really see more than anything is the first signs of the melting pot. And I would argue it doesn't exist before the 1920s, but the predominance of American culture and big business starts to eat away at the distinctions between the various community groups. One of the other major trends at this particular time is black migration. What you had to remember is in the decade before the 1920s, African Americans lived in the South. The overwhelming majority of them. Most of them were poverty stricken. Most of them were sharecroppers. These are farm workers who work for a share of the crops they grow instead of a wage. They occupy the lowest economic positions in relation to other regions of the United States. And they exist in a de facto segregation. Okay, people of different racial groups, i.e., black versus white, are kept apart from each other in the South. However, during the 1920s, about 850,000 African Americans will migrate from the South to the North. This is known as the Great Migration, or the Great Black Migration. And they find themselves searching for industrial and manufacturing jobs, but again, tending to get the worst paid jobs. Okay, this is due to really a mixture of racism and poor education that they came with. But what we also see is them starting to congregate like the Italians or like the Jews in the large communities in ethnic ghettos. The most notable of them is the Harlem ghetto of northeastern Manhattan. In Harlem, you have a completely unique thing happen. It becomes the center of African American cultural life. You have the development of a black literary movement, a black artistic movement, a black musical movement. And the Harlem Renaissance, as it comes to be called, is really has a very powerful effect on culture, music, media, not only in America but nationwide. Additionally, you get a little bit of fight back. Blacks, for the first time, will rally around civil rights leaders. The first and most notable of these is a man named Marcus Garvey, and they create what's known as the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Okay, and this is really the first black political movement. Um, what we have in Harlem is this really unique flourishing of the black community, something that we'll look at a little bit more in class. All of this, not only black migration to the north, but the ghettoization, continued migration of large portions of ethnic groups from Europe, lead to a backlash against immigration by natives. Okay, the idea amongst the native-born Americans, still the 85%, was that they were losing their cities to undesirable newcomers. Um, Prior to this new wave of immigration, more than 60% of Americans could trace their ancestry back to the British Isles or to Germany. Now, what they started to fear was these new wave of Catholic, Jewish, new immigrants. Okay, they believed in the very traditional social Darwinistic view that they're inferior members of lesser races, likely lacking the sort of the temperament of the Anglo-Saxon, which many people believed it was necessary to maintain a free society and for the benefit of commerce, etc. These new immigrants, in the eyes of the many of the native-born people, and this sort of bubbles up in the 1920s, lack the self-discipline, the work ethic. They live immoral lifestyles. They couldn't be trusted not to throw their votes away. They were, let's say, prolonging the corruption of the boss system, which hadn't been totally eradicated. Okay, and what they feared more than anything was that the balance would be tipped away from white Protestant people. Now, in reality, they had nothing to fear, but the backlash is quite strong. I'm going to go through a number of examples. What we see in the 1920s is the birth of what we call Americanization campaigns. Ideas that it becomes necessary to stir the melting pot. One of the best examples of that was what Henry Ford did in his particular factories. He declared, and he actually absolutely despised the nature of the new immigrants, even though he relied on them for cheap labor. He basically said that the men of all of the nations who come need to be taught how to be American. They need to learn American ways. They need to learn the English language, and they need to learn the quote unquote right way to live, which was essentially Henry Ford's way. Ford forced every immigrant worker at his automotive factory, for instance, to attend an Americanization course. These would last months and months and months. They were schooled in the English language to Ford's acceptable standard, and also they were schooled in Ford's very conservative, very Republican ideology. At the end of each course, they would have these really, really, really horrible parties, if you will, or graduation ceremonies that are akin to a pageant. Workers clad in these like gaudy versions of their native clothes. Imagine a Ukrainian wearing their sheepskin coat and the babushka climbing into a giant melting pot, a literally giant melting pot. I'll show you a picture of this in a sec. Only to climb out on the other side after changing in the melting pot into traditional American clothing like suits and stuff and waving American flags. Anyways, this program was backed by all sorts of coercion. Ford even had a sociological department which investigated the home lives of those workers to make sure that they were living to the American standard he desired. Anyone who didn't live up to a standard would lose their job. And here's just an incredible picture. One of the mottos of the United States is E pluribus unum. And I remember very vividly Barack Obama quoting that in his 2004 Democratic speech. E pluribus unum, out of many one. And then he goes on to make this wonderful post-modernist or post-racial argument, which underscores his campaign for the presidency in 2008. It's a brilliant speech. You should watch it if you do. Not that I'm sharing my political views with you, but it is a really darn good speech. Anyways, make a long story short, what this all results into, and we see from the growth of Americanization sentiment and the need to encourage people to learn the right way, what becomes known as the National Origins and Immigration Restriction Act. This law, it comes around in 1924. It's really known as the Immigration Act. And what it does for the first time in American history is it imposes a quota, a limit that is, on the number of immigrants allowed to enter the United States. Number one, the limits were based on national origins, where you came from, and also there were quotas for immigrants from each country. So these were pegged in representation to the population of the United States in either the 1910 or in the 1890s. Okay, and what that means is that what you have is the white Protestant majority going back in time to a time when they were dominant and ensuring that the new amount of immigrants who could come in, for example, would never tip the balance away from white Protestant dominance. So, for instance, if you were from Southern and Eastern Europe, okay, you were limited to 22,000 people a year. That's a 97% reduction. If you were from North and Western Europe, 140,000 arrivals per year. If you were from China, only 5 Chinese could come. Ukrainians, for instance, only 60 of those could come. These are just some examples of what is clearly a racially selective policy in terms of who can come. Now, what is the effect of all of this? Well, it's pretty startling in many ways. Prior to the quota, immigrants were arriving at a rate of about just under 1 million a year, 850,000. Most of those coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. The majority of the rest coming from Northern and Western Europe. What we see, okay, afterwards is many as a 80 to 90% decrease. Okay, the difficulties in determining the precise proportions of the 1980 population meant that the law didn't really take place until the later part of the 1920s, and the onset of the Great Depression naturally curbs immigration to a great deal because nobody wants to immigrate to the United States when mass unemployment is the norm. But what we do see is that the 1920s sees a pretty startling slowdown in immigration, which sort of is effectively a break from the policies of open immigration, more or less, that had happened beforehand. For women, the 1920s is often considered a time of great social progress, but that's not always and not necessarily the case in every. Okay, so when we talk about women, again, we need to consider that there's the image and the reality. Now, here is the image. Here are the real things that happen to some women. Okay, the idea is that women in the 1920s became quote unquote flappers. This is a sophisticated, fashionable, pleasure mad young women. The flapper, in essence, reflects pretty important changes in the life of American women in the 1920s. New fashions, new dance, more carefree, pleasure-seeking lifestyle. Women didn't have to make the home. They didn't have to depend on their husband. They could seek work as typists, secretaries, clerks in a rapidly expanding American economy. They had sexual freedom. There were birth control used to avoid unwanted pregnancies. What we see is this image coming to dominate how people thought of women in the 1920s. Also, too, they smoked a lot. However, this is in many ways a creation of the advertising age. A few lessons ago, I talked to you about mass media and advertising being a really important thing that underscores why American industry booms in the 1920s, that they're selling on a massive scale. And they put out this image of the 1920s women liberated, smoking, drinking, working, and buying in order to encourage women with their newfound wealth to purchase what they want. In reality, like all stereotypes, the flapper reflects only really one aspect of life and the role of women in American society. For instance, Vassar, one of the great universities in America, one of the most prestigious women's universities, I should add, offers courses in being a wife, being a mother, and running the family as an economic unit. In many ways, the decade really really a period of unfulfilled expectations for many women. It had begun with great, great, great promise, but in the end, really not. They of course they get the right to vote at the start of the decade, but in the reality, it never really materialized. Okay. By 1928, the League of Women Voters was able to proclaim that 145 women had won seats and 35 state legislatures, and two had become governors. But these were the exceptions because when you look at the large picture, the overwhelming majority of government workers were male dominated. Okay. It's also important to remember at this time that in 1923, a National Women's Party is founded by Alice Paul, but it gets absolutely nowhere. They campaigned to have equal rights throughout the United States, but effectively they're defeated. Women don't vote for them in massive numbers. And what you get is the 1920s, supposedly this era of women's liberation, really is also the era when women's liberation dies because the feminist movement goes dormant from 1920 and doesn't appear until the 1960s again. This is also a time of culture attacks. The 1920s, of course, and the culture grows out of the material abundance of the age, mass consumption, mass production. And as a result, you get these wondrous new machines transforming everyday life, and culture itself becomes a mass commodity. The 20s is the heyday of the broadcast radio and the Hollywood cinema. You get consumers across the country tuning into the same radio programs, buying tickets to the same films. Advertising then becomes crucial to the industry in its own right. But on the flip side of that, what you get is intellectuals beginning to attack this match culture. They called it the bourgeoisie. Many of the great American literature in the 1920s represent an intellectual backlash to what's happening in terms of the culture of the everyday person. Okay, they hate the materialism, the conformity, the inauthenticity of this new mass culture meant to sell products rather than be a reflection of the greatness or what America is really about. St. Clair Lewis will profile the conformity in what he calls Babbitt in his book, and boosterism in The Salesman. Babbitt. H.L. Mencken will talk about the middle class and their mediocrity in what he called the bourgeoisie idea. The bourgeoisie, a term referring to the middle class, was referred to the bourgeoisie, i.e., they're stupid. And again, many of the great American writers feeling that the American culture had been debased go off to Europe, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and they write great books, very highly critical of America, i.e. The Great Gatsby, but they do so from a Paris cafe. The couple last points here. What we see in the 1920s is a conflict of ideology, and we get a real sense of culture war. You get the country versus the city, and tradition versus modernity. We've talked a little bit about this in lesson, but let's review it quickly right now. The rapid pace of technological advance, okay, means that there's an equally large backlash among those Americans left behind by modernity. And who are we talking about here? We're talking about the farmers. Basically, they didn't get any economic gains from this new economy. You get nativists, people who hate this new immigration. You get Christian fundamentalists. The 1920s is an age of fundamentalism. And they're angered by Darwin's challenges to the literal word of God. They hate the idea that evolution is a big thing. And we see this in the Scopes monkey trial. And you get traditional moralists. They despise the sexual liberation, the idea of sex outside of marriage and birth control. They hate the idea of the flapper. They hate the idea of the illegal booze of the speakeasy, which is pretty common in just about every American city. The biggest example of cultural backlash, and one thing that you do have to account for, is the resurrection of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. Okay, this traditionalist backlash will take many forms, but its most dramatic manifestation is the Ku Klux Klan. This was an organization that starts in the South after the Civil War. The Confederate cavalry general Nathan Bedford Forrest creates this as a paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party to terrorize blacks, newly emancipated with their freedoms, to dissuade them from exercising the civil rights that had been won in the Civil War. After Reconstruction collapses in 1876 and you get de facto segregation again, the Klan goes away. But in the 1920s, and actually a little bit earlier, the Klan starts to emerge. In 1915, a Hollywood movie called The Birth of the Nation is created by a man named D.W. Griffith. It becomes a hit. Woodrow Wilson calls it one of the greatest movies he's ever seen. Actually, he says that it's history writ with lighting, all so terribly true. Essentially, Wilson endorses this film's historical revisionism, basically says that the Klan is a great and noble organization. What you have in that movie is a depiction, if you will, of how the Klan originated and what its goals are. And the most controversial scene sees a white hooded Klansman riding gallantly to the rescue of a white woman who's about to be raped by a savage black man. The Birth of a Nation, if you were to watch it today, is absolutely disgusting. But the 1915, 1920s era, it set records for box office profits that would last until 22 years. Trying to think of the next movie. I think it's The Wizard of Oz, actually, that dethrones Birth of the Nation as the biggest #1 movie in Hollywood history up until that point. The film has another I don't want to say benefit, that has another important contribution. It leads to the rebirth of the new Ku Klux Klan, and this is led by a failed doctor named William J. Simmons. He recreates or reconstitutes the Klan in Atlanta. The Grand Wizard, which is the name given to the overseer of the entire Klan, spreads the KKK throughout the United States. It becomes the most important mouthpiece for traditionalist policy because it's not only anti-black, it's anti-Catholic, it's anti-Semitic, it's anti-communist, it's anti-immigrant, it's anti-alcohol, it's anti-sex, and it's anti-science. It is a all-encompassing umbrella group for everything traditionalists find wrong with the country. And its success and its greatest strengths are not in the South even. They're in the West, in the Midwest. They'll begin to control state Congress, okay, in Colorado and Indiana. You'll have a governor who's a Klansman. In Oregon, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and several other states, you'll have the majority of the legislatures belonging to the members of legislators belonging to the Klan as members. By the middle of 1920s, they estimate that 4 million Americans were paid members of the Ku Klux Klan. This really reveals more than anything, importantly, not only the continued racism and anti-black sentiment, but the depth of traditionalist resistance to the social and cultural changes of the 1920s. So, I'm actually going to leave this for you, okay, and talk about its political influence in that. There's some extra reading, and we'll do a little bit more reading on the importance of the Klan. There's been some past essay questions on this. But what we need to know is that by the end of the decade, the membership in the Klan starts to fall. The immigration restrictions put through in 1919 and again in 1924 with the National Origins Act really undermines the purpose of the Klan. And in many ways, it does reduce the grievances of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or WASP population. And as a consequence, the Klan, and I don't want to make this comparison too tritely, but when a single issue group has that issue taken away, for the most part, it ceases to be an effective pressure group. And that's what happens to the Klan. And its membership falls quite dramatically by the end of the 1920s. The Klan still exists in its very clandestine form today. Here is an essay question accounting for the rise of the KKK. So what leads to it? Well, in brief, you get World War I. The war brings a heightened sense of nationalism. It leads to a rise in non-Anglo-Saxon immigration, people fleeing war-torn countries. And many people in the South start to fear the return of African-American servicemen who had fought in France. And for instance, in East St. Louis, a returning African-American servicemen were singled out for lynching because these people had learned to shoot, they had learned to fight, they'd been empowered by the army, and in essence, they had become too uppity. Of course, you get Birth of the Nation, the influence of that. Third, of course, there's an anti-communist sentiment that aligns itself with the Red Scare. And fourth, immigration, which is a predominant issue, but especially new immigration in the post-war era before, of course, the curbs on immigration account for the rise of the Klan. A couple last things. The blacks did not take this mildly. Of course, with the Harlem Renaissance, a new sense of Black identity is developing, and in essence, you also get Black civil rights group. The most important group formed in the 1920s is known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. The NAACP will campaign for the abolition of segregation in the South, the Jim Crow laws, and equal voting rights. It's led by a man named W.E.B. Du Bois. He becomes one of the first major civil rights leaders. It has some successes early on, but we'll see a lot of successes in the 1950s and the 1960s. For instance, Georgia had a grandfather clause that said that you couldn't vote in Georgia unless your father had been a voter, or grandfather had been a voter in the time before the Civil War, which meant that Black people in Georgia couldn't have voted. And they get this one declared unconstitutional in the Supreme Court, which leads to an increase in Black voting in Georgia, for instance. The NAACP was a pressure group that targeted government and gave Black people a voice. The last thing I want to mention too, and I've talked about this, so I'll leave it very clearly, is the best example of religious fundamentalism and traditionalism pushing back against the modernity that people fear is the Scopes monkey trial. When famously, a teacher is put on trial for teaching evolution. He's found guilty, though he doesn't serve any time in jail. He gets a fine that's eventually commuted. But what we see is a nationwide, really, the nation takes interest in this sensational trial where effectively God is put on trial, or at least the belief that God created the universe is put on trial versus evolution. In the South, in the 1920s, God wins, but ultimately the Scopes monkey trial is probably a long-term victory for evolutionists, as the interest in the trial and eventually the way people respond to Scopes, who receives almost no punishment at all, is a reflection of people's changing attitudes. So you really get the sort of the balance of the culture war I talked about. Now, that's a little bit of a long lesson. Lots going on culturally and socially in the 1920s. You do have to know about a couple of the key issues, predominantly the KKK, but you should also have a good handle on women in the 1920s, and account for the sort of the rise in women's liberation amongst some other things. So do pay attention, and hope you have and use these notes effectively.